I'm delighted to introduce Karthik, who is one of our longtime supporters and has been part of the Big Data initiative for many, many years. I'll let Karthik do his introduction. I don't want to steal his thunder. And Karthik will also introduce the rest of the panel that we have for today. Enjoy and have a great evening. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, folks. Good evening. Thanks for taking the time. So today's panel is going to be about the confluence of big data and security. So I'm going to introduce the panelists and then maybe a 5-minute introduction to the topic. I presented at the Hadoop Summit. I don't know how many of you, show of hands, were at the Hadoop Summit this summer in the Hortonworks Summit. Very few. So I've got a number of requests from Thai as well as some others about having a repeat of the session, which was about the confluence of big data and security. But that presentation was heavily technical. Today we won't go into the technical depth of what big data and security mean. What we are going to go through is a bit about the most common use cases in security and tee up the topic as, why is security a big data topic? It's not simply because security is hard and big data is hard. There are certain elements of security which make it prime to be considered a big data problem. And the technologies that you apply in big data to solve some other problems clearly apply in security. So with that, I'm going to introduce the panel, but then I'll take 5 minutes to introduce the topic. So Rohit Gupta, VP of Biz Dev from Alert Logic, is one of our panelists. Come up, Rohit. Venki Anant, Engagement Manager at McKinsey, also a contributor in the big data space, sees a lot of things in the big data space. And Bob Pratt, former VP of Product Management at ArcSight, which, as you all know, is now part of HP, and he was one of the guys instrumental in taking the company public. So with that, let me see if I can get the presentation going here. Okay, so while we wait for it to come up, so the first thing I want to tee up is the major concepts of security. Security, as you all know, is a pretty horizontally applicable topic. Different industries have different forms of security. There is simply cybersecurity, there is fraud, there's different elements of security. But a couple of key dimensions about security and how people perform the job of security. There's this common incident analysis, which is a very reactive approach to security, which is when you know an incident has happened, you have to go investigate it. Then there is the concept of anomaly detection, which is, if you have a certain baseline about your environment, you know some things are normal, you can catch a deviation. But then the key is to know what's normal, so you can catch the deviation. These are simple rule-based things. Queries at scale. Now we start to get into the concept of big data here. Queries at scale, which means if you look at an environment today, if you're really closely watching, let's say, a web gateway, you'll notice that in a day, you can have tens of billions of events pass through. That's how much data you're going to capture. We're not going to talk about the volume of the problems, big data, but the fact is, performing queries at scale, if you really have to investigate what's going on, you have to be able to operate at this kind of scale of data really fast. And predetermined metrics. It's important for you to know what the state of security for your environment is. So it's almost like having KPIs, as in the business world, in security. And most security practitioners have that kind of information. Now, a couple of market slides here. If you see here, this is, you can't read the bottom, Barclays, a CIO survey done early this year. I think it was in January of this year. The top two things that are on people's CIOs' minds, big data and security. Right? And they have to be solved together. People are not looking at these as different problems, have to be solved together. Next up, this is a very famous and now annual Verizon report. It's called the Data Breaches and Incident Report. It's freely available. There is a link here. It's freely available on the Verizon website. It's a great reading. It's about 60-odd pages. It comes every year, and it covers the gamut of cyber attacks to insider fraud and all kinds of other things that a security professional should worry about. The reason I bring this up here is, well, first of all, if you're interested in security and big data, it's a great reading. But the fact is, and I've slightly manipulated the presentation here, the fact is there is evidence about how much advanced attackers are compared to the defenders. And it takes a lot less time to compromise a system than it takes to detect it. Forget about resolving it. Right? So that gap has increased over time. And this is really, really important because the attacker needs to succeed once. The defender has to be 100% successful every single time. So the onus is on the defender to improve the state of security big time. I'll skip this. There's a couple of more reports, and this one's from Mary Meeker, used to be on Wall Street, now part of Kleiner Perkins, did a whole internet survey report. She does this annually as well. A section of it from late last year or early this year was on security. And that was the first time I think she covered security in the Internet Trends report. Really important. And I think you all must have heard on the way in today that JP Morgan Chase was compromised. How many of you heard about that? A hacker attack. And JP Morgan Chase has been known to be the gold standard for cybersecurity, being able to prevent it. But like I said, the attacker has to succeed once, right? You have to be, as a defender, successful every single time. So if you summarize all of this, top of mind things are big data and security. And the fact is, the variety of security events, you have a number of endpoints, people bring their own devices. There are various dimensions now. You can be on the cloud, you can be a remote user through a VPN at home, a mobile user, a desktop user. There's so many things happening that the variety of events is not the same. It's not like web analytics where all you're doing is analyzing. That's a big data problem too, web analytics, e-commerce and advertising. But here you're dealing with a terrific number of different kinds of events coming in. So it's really key, right? The multidimensional problem. Analysis sophistication. You really have to be able to coordinate and triangulate events, and then you derive the patterns out of it. You have to know that a certain event happened at the same time as a bunch of other events. So there's a variety of correlations that are happening behind the scenes. This is key. Again, it's a multidimensional problem. There's an element of time, there's an element of scale. These are all dimensions of why this is a big data problem. Finally, just a scale issue, context of time. What typically happens today with current day technologies that are not very big data proficient is you maintain a couple of days worth of security events because the volume of that data is very, very large. So you rely on incident analysis or some sort of real-time spotting of a bad activity. And then the data gets recycled. You don't really keep a lot of data. But in order to detect things such as state-sponsored attacks, which are becoming more prevalent, you're now worried about Russia and countries attacking companies, as in the case of JP Morgan Chase today. In order to do this, APTs, which are advanced persistent threats, have this tendency to exist or lurk on a network for months at a time without doing anything, and then act up, and then go dormant again, and then act up again. If you keep 3, 5, 7, 30 days of data, you're never really going to catch an APT. So the context of scale comes in. You have to store years of data. You have to store this intelligently. You don't want to keep all the raw data. But these are dimensions why this becomes really, really important. Finally, before we get into the panel, what this all means. And it's not quite as simple as putting it all into Hadoop and the problem is solved. That is not it at all. This is a real representation of what you will ultimately end up doing, but not quite as simplistically. So we'll jump through a lot of these topics. We'll have a lot of time at the end for Q&A. We have a set of topics that we will tee it off with, which will cover not just technology. The goal here is to leave the room with a feeling of where can you take this next with the knowledge you got today. So we will cover topics like who is the security buyer, who are the decision makers, what kind of use cases, what are the panelists seeing out there in terms of real use cases and non-real use cases. We'll talk a bit about technology as well as to what technologies apply, what are myths, what are realities. These are topics we're going to cover. So keep in your minds any questions that you have, and we will cover it. We have maybe an hour worth of prepared panel discussions and half an hour after that for Q&A. All right? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob to do a bit of an opening statement and an introduction, and then we'll go around and do the same with everybody, and then we'll get into the panel. Yeah, now it's on.
That's what I get for cutting my fingernails. I couldn't push the red button. At least made my wife happy. Anyway, thanks, Karthik. As he mentioned, I think you wanted just each of us to give a couple of minutes overview, and then we'll go into Q&A. So I'm I ran product management for ArcSight for about the last 5 years. The last 4 years as an independent company, and then a year for Hewlett Packard, which was an interesting experience in and of itself. The interesting thing about ArcSight is while we didn't describe ourselves as a big data company and we didn't think of ourselves that way, in a lot of ways, ArcSight was founded as a big data company back in 2000 because the purpose of the company, the reason we were founded was in 2000, people were starting to deploy these newfangled firewalls and IDSs all over the place. And they realized that they were logging lots and lots of events, so many events that humans couldn't look through them and figure out what's causing all these events to pile up in my checkpoint log. And so ArcSight was created with the original goal of sucking in all those firewall events and narrowing them down to, okay, those 64,000 events are all because one IP address in China is port scanning your firewall. So you're getting one event for every port, and that's the problem. And we expanded a little over the decade or so. We were an independent company to handle more than just firewall events, but that was the fundamental idea. And by the end of my tenure there, sort of when we had been merged into HP, we were getting questions, like I had a serious question from somebody at the Department of Homeland Security saying, you know, could we build an ArcSight system for them that would handle 3 million events per second on a sustained basis and store all that into a database? And would that be worthwhile? Of course, my first answer was, as an ArcSight shareholder, that would be absolutely worthwhile. That would be terrific. But I couldn't imagine what they would do with it, because let's say you build that system, and we could have built it. How do humans write rules to deal with that many events and that many different types of events coming, from systems ranging from everywhere from Asia to the US to all over the world, feeding in all these different events at the rate of millions per second? Humans not only can't look at that data, they can't even write a rule set to manage that data. And that's what I'm now looking into, is sort of applying big data to the problem in the new sense of big data, not just using Hadoop and Hadoop-like technologies to store everything, but also looking at how we can apply machine learning and advanced AI techniques, essentially, to analyzing the data and really get the human out of that analysis loop, because it's just not practical anymore. The data has passed our ability to keep up with it. And that's what gets me excited about this area, is it's really, up until now, whether it was ArcSight or Splunk or other security companies prior to those, we really focused on ways to make the security analyst able to do their job better and faster, and just sort of keep making the analyst a little faster and a little faster and a little faster. We've now reached the point where we can't make the analyst any faster. They're hitting a wall and saying, okay, now we need some better way to handle the problem. And you see that if you look at the example you gave, or if you look at Target last fall, or for that matter, look at the NSA. The NSA, I think it's safe to say, and they were actually my biggest customer, they spend more on security products than any commercial company. And they can put their employees through much greater hoops than what you can do as a commercial company. The level of background checking, security, polygraphs. If you tried to do that at a Target or a JP Morgan Chase, people would just quit. But they can do it because they're the NSA. And yet they still got breached, and they still got huge amounts of data stolen by Edward Snowden. So if they can't solve the problem, if you're a commercial company, you kind of have no prayer of solving it with people. And so that's why we need a next generation of technology that takes big data and actually does something more sophisticated with it than just giving the users cool tools for searching through it and visualizing it manually. So that's my viewpoint.
Venki, yours?
Thank you, Bob. Hello, everyone. I'm Venki Anand. Work for McKinsey & Company. I'm a technologist by education, so I've done a bunch of engineering jobs in the past, and then ran a startup for a few years, which was largely focused on big data and analytics. And I had the chance of working with ArcSight for a while. We used to be their visualization engine for a few years. And then over in McKinsey, my focus has been around business technology, which overall deals with the technology landscape. But more interestingly, lately has been largely focused on analytics, business intelligence. Of course, there's a big drive towards the cloud, and I think more recently towards the cybersecurity space. And let me actually take a step back and just look at what's happened in the past 6-7 years. By the way, 6-7 years back, I was much more in tune with technology. I was a technologist coding actively. Now that I'm a consultant, I know we can make a lot of jokes about consulting, but it's given me the chance to take a step back and look at what has happened. I think in the past 7 years, almost everyone here would agree that we've made leaps and bounds in growth in technology, not just from a nuts and bolts perspective, but I think largely from the realization or the maturity in our thought process of not just connecting the world to the internet, but actually driving value. And what I mean by that is, in the past couple of years, we've all seen value through the connected world. We have our cell phones, we're able to hail a cab, we're able to go to a restaurant, make the reservations online as we go there. And there's enormous productivity gain that we've gained in the past few years. And I think the enterprises are also looking at the same kind of value. It's more around the targeted advertising that they have seen, or any sort of business that they're driving through some of these analytics that they're driving on top. And I think as we see the growth, we've also seen the other side, in the world of karmic balance, when we talk about the good and the evil. Obviously, we're looking at a lot of these security and the risk thresholds that are being breached as we go into the market, right? And if we push that conversation of value towards the security landscape, I think what comes to the fore is there is enormous value that needs to be driven by the security landscape and the people who are driving the security and the risk profile for quite a few of our enterprise customers. And what I mean by that is, as Bob was mentioning earlier, NSA, for example, right? They're driving their people to jump through hoops all the time. There's an enormous loss of productivity there. Can we make that much more streamlined, right? That's sort of the productivity and the value that you can drive from your employees. As someone who's using technology myself, and you can call me sort of old-fashioned, but I'm still scared to use or trade using my cell phone, right? I'm still, as soon as I hear a stock code, or if I want to sell something, buy something, I'm trying to hook up to the computer rather than using a cell phone. And probably I should trust my security vendors a little bit more, but that's the comfort level that I have today. And by doing that, I'm leaving enormous value on the table. Every minute that I delay between making the decision and actually taking action, I am leaving value on the table, right? And if you just do the basic math on it, the value that the enterprises and the individuals as us are leaving on the table because of our lack of confidence and security is like trillions of dollars, right? So that's what we're going to see in the next few years as we come. This is the conversations that we have with CISOs, with CIOs, on what's the value that the enterprises are leaving on the table, not adopting the latest and greatest. And I think almost everyone goes back to big data and analytics and talks about Hadoop and how can they drive all the data that's in their enterprise to actually drive the value. And that's how I see this entire landscape kind of evolving. And I know it's sort of a 50,000 feet view of the entire landscape, but that's how you see it. It's just the value that you're going to see come out of all of this in the next 3 to 5 years.
Rohit, thank you. Rohit Gupta with a company called Alert Logic. It's actually not a Silicon Valley company. It's based in Houston, Texas, and we all know how much of a technology haven that is. But the difference we actually have, which is interesting, and until Bob and other people like him fix the problem of really analyzing security events, people have to still continue to run their businesses. So what we do is we provide part of a security solution as software, but also as people. So we take over the security problem for companies and realize that it's not something that can be solved completely today, at least, with software. And so we have a 24/7 security operations center that looks at the big data engine and the results coming out of it. So we actually, before we call somebody and say, hey, so there's a real problem here, we look at the data and decide if it's really a problem. And I think if some of you have been in security, you would have seen that a lot of the alerts coming out of systems are false positives. And so there's only so many times a systems administrator or a SOC analyst is going to wake up in the middle of the night and go check something out and find out that it was not a real incident. And so until that problem gets solved, and I'm sure it will, you need people. So that's really the way we are seeing the businesses go. And as people move more and more to environments that are out of their control, like public cloud environments, Amazon, Google, Azure, whatever it might be, there is a certain value you get by having these environments in the cloud, somebody else looking at your data and your application, but you also have that loss of control. And so you have to have people who really are experts in that, who have the ability to look at data across a whole range of customers. So even companies like JPMC, they have a certain set of data they can look at, which is only for their own purposes. But when you can look at data across companies and across continents and across industries, that's when you really can get insights that are unique. And so we're trying to take that approach with software and people to provide security to our customers. That's really the approach here. And so far it's been good. We're still a small company, but it's been a good ride.
Why don't you hang on to the mic, Rohit? We'll go the reverse direction. So, some of what Bob, Venki, and Rohit mentioned in their opening statements tease up the first topic pretty nicely, which is, when we talk about security as a problem area, what are some of these challenges that enterprises face? That is an important thing to understand and grasp. When I talk to CIOs and CISOs, I look at, I bubble up everything that they say into a couple of different categories, and I want to see what everybody thinks about it. I see, very broadly speaking, external threats. Am I getting attacked from the outside? Yes, that's a valid problem. But within that, there's a multitude of things that you're specifically looking for. But let's stay at that level. And then there is the insider threat, which is either maliciously, as one CIO put it, non-maliciously, ignorant usage, both lead to insider-led problems, which is you could be exfiltrating data, corporate IP data, or participating in some sort of financial fraud as an insider, or inadvertently your account could have been compromised, or you're doing something out of ignorance or on a technology that compromises your company. So very broadly, I see external and internal threats. But I want to get a level below that, and kind of in your experiences, Rohit, what are you seeing as some of the more important security challenges of today? We'll talk about the cloud and mobile angles later, but leaving those angles aside, what do you think are some of the challenges?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think that enterprises obviously have a bigger risk exposure because of the assets that they are responsible for. But the problem is the same if you go down the stack to small, medium enterprise or even SMB. I think the biggest problem in this market right now is people don't know they've been compromised. If you look at the statistics, by and large, every major organization has been compromised. The problem is that they don't know. And so data is leaving the network. We talked about, Karthik mentioned that as well. It's happening over a long period of time. So just getting visibility into what has happened and how you're compromised is probably the biggest problem in my view. And then the other side of that is, okay, what do I do? So then it becomes, okay, I cannot stop these guys because they will get in. How do I know it's happened and what do I do about it? And that becomes a risk management problem. But I think that if you really sort of boil it down, ultimately, I know I cannot keep up, so the best thing I can do is find out as quickly as I can and find out the extent of the damage so I can fix it. That's really, I think, where the opportunity also lies, but the problem is still there.
Completely agree with what Rohit and Karthik have mentioned. I would, although, just sort of segment the market a little bit. So if you look at some of these vendors or players who have been in the market for a while now, and let me rephrase, the enterprises have been in the market now for quite some time, largely either through regulatory or other compliance issues. So take in case the financial and the healthcare industry, for example. I think in those industries, the core focus is around, as Karthik mentioned, the insider threats and the APTs and where people are stretching the boundaries of what's the baseline, right? That's sort of the focus there. If you look at the other part, which is, I would say, small size retail, people who are sort of late to the party, they started converting and maybe making investments in security in the past 4 or 5 years. And the big question for them is, what is or how much investment do I need to make? Where are all my vulnerabilities? And then there's, of course, the other end of the spectrum, which is largely manufacturing and people who are in traditional businesses. For them, I think what Rohit mentioned is extremely relevant. I think they have no clue of, or I wouldn't say no clue, but very limited understanding of what are the various assets that could get compromised and where are all the vulnerabilities. And I think that's where there's, again, a lot of growth that needs to happen as well, just to increase and raise their standards up. So to Karthik's point, I think the insider threat awareness and the response to insider threats is, I think, a little bit more valid on the higher end of the spectrum. And I think the external threats, of course, almost everyone underneath that is focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I violently agree with everyone. I think the problem fundamentally is that people don't know, they don't even know what assets they have, let alone what security breaches. By the way, one of the scary factoids from the Verizon report that Karthik mentioned in his opening, the average time, tell me if anybody knows this, what the average time to discovering a breach is, according to Verizon? Yeah, exactly. It's a little over 250 days. Not hours, not, 250 days. In other words, most of a year. And that's, so whether your antivirus system finds stuff an hour faster or not, who cares? I mean, when you're talking about 250 days, if you cut it down to a month, that's a huge improvement. And not only do people don't know they've been breached, or they haven't found it out yet because it takes so long, they don't even know what assets they have. One of my very first jobs was for a company called Exelan about 25 years ago. And one of the products we built right after we got bought by Novell, but right after we got bought by Novell, we built this thing that was a network management platform. And part of what it did was auto-discover your network, which in 1990-91 was a really cool thing. It would draw a map of all your IP devices and how they were connected. People loved it just for that feature because they didn't know what they had on their network. And the sad thing is now, almost 25 years later, that hasn't changed at all. Enterprises don't know what assets they have. They don't even know what systems are on their network. They might know how many physical PCs they have, but don't ask them about tablets and mobile devices and everything else, or they just don't want to know. Or they want to know, but they don't. And I think that's the biggest security challenge is you can't secure what you don't understand. And they don't understand what's on the network. They don't understand where the breaches are. And that's where we're collecting all this data, because now there's lots of security products. And if you throw all this stuff together, you probably could create a complete picture. There's just too much data, I think, for humans to deal with right now. And it's only going to keep getting worse. I mean, there's now, according to Cisco, almost 2 internet-connected devices for every human being on the planet. And needless to say, that's not an exact ratio of 1 to 1. I'm skewing that on the high end because I think my house probably has 20 or 30 in it. And parts of Africa and so on would have much less. But the problem is just going to keep getting worse. So I think what we need to do in terms of data is just help people understand what they've got and what's going on with it.
So I've got a fancy.
You have the cool one.
So yeah, exactly. Which keeps coming in front of my face, and I want to swat it. So 2 important things that came up. I think they're very important points. But before that, it's 243 days to be exact. If it makes a difference. So you saved the whole week there, right? So that's good. So 2 important things that came up, and this is real as we talk to customers, and this is my experience too. Not knowing an inventory of what is on your network. Right? That's a very important thing. The second thing is the fact that you don't know you've been breached. And often, even the 243 days later, it's often 80% of the time a third party that informs you that something got stolen or your credit card was out in the open, and that's when they find out. It's not because the company itself in 243 days found out. It's because a third party notified them saying, hey, what's my credit card doing out there? I see my name and credit card information out there. And that's when they discover a violation of some sort of theft. So that's where I think several technologies can apply. And hopefully what we're all taking out of this is gaps that exist out there and things that still have yet to be filled in the industry. Call it big data, call it security, but these are some of the challenges. So an important thing that I've noted in the last, at least, I'd say 6 to 12 months, maybe a little over that, is the emergence of not just the title, but the importance of the title of CISO, Chief Information Security Officer. So until, say, 2 years ago, a bunch of my colleagues or friends or others have been CIOs, and they call the shots. And security is really an IT function. So there is an IT security function. There is the security analyst. The bigger companies have SOCs, like security operations centers, where they have specialists who are doing nothing but 24/7 analysis of data. But for the most part, the CIOs running most of these operations are security administrators. But lately, what we've seen is the emergence of the importance of a role called the CISO, right? And CISO is not a new person, but the roles become more and more important. I want to get the panel's opinion on, are you seeing the same kind of thing, as in the CISO becoming at least as powerful as the CIO? And what do you think is the future for a CISO?
So I guess we'll go back down the row again. I don't know that I think the CISO is as powerful as the CIO. I'm definitely seeing them emerge, though, as having more of a line responsibility, having people actually reporting to them as opposed to being sort of a security advisor to the CIO. It may just be that I'm more cynical. I think a big part of that is CIOs are tired of getting fired for breaches. And if the CISO is responsible for it, now he can get fired. So I think there's some self-interest on the CIO's part in making sure someone else clearly is responsible when there's a breach. Because you can't stop them, you might as well set someone up for the blame. But no, seriously though, I am seeing CISOs having a lot more responsibility and actually running and being in charge of doing stuff, as opposed to, as Karthik said a few years ago, the CISO was largely an advisor. They didn't actually operate anything. And so that is a big change. And I think it's a good change, even if it does mean some nice guys will get fired in the short term.
So Bob, I agree with that. But my personal opinion, I think what I've learned in the past few years is the CISO is, I think, increasing the influence in the decision making on purchasing and the overall security program for whatever enterprise or the organization it is. I think what needs to happen is the CISO needs to get a little bit straight line of sight to the CEO and the board to really raise the risk profile and the profile of the security programs to the board. And again, when I talk the board, I'm talking about the large public companies, multi-billion dollars. Of course, the smaller companies, obviously the CISO role, especially companies focused on technology, I think it's extremely, extremely sort of important, and it's gained importance in the past couple of years more than so it had done in the past. But I still think in the really large enterprises, there still is like multiple layers between the CISO and the CEO. And given the fact that technically the risk role essentially lies with the CFO, a lot of the times the CISO is somewhere in between the CIO and the CFO. And that sort of does not bring the security profile up as it should. But I'm guessing based on what we have seen in the past 6 months, the several breaches we've seen where heads have rolled, not just from the CISO perspective, but all the way up to the CEO. I'm guessing that raises the profile and will continue to raise the profile as we go forward.
Yeah, I agree completely. And Bob, the CEO of Target got fired, so it doesn't always end at the CISO or the CIO, right? But yes, the CISO is definitely gaining importance. And I think one of the things that we're seeing as well is the whole merging, if you will, of risk and compliance with security. So people that need to be compliant are frequently taking over the compliance as the baseline for security. And so some companies are saying, compliance from PCI compliant or whatever my choice is good enough. And they cannot even get there, so getting above that is clearly difficult. But the CISO having that responsibility of reporting to the board on compliance requirements is another reason why I think that role is starting to become more important. This is becoming a board-level conversation. And clearly at Target, it would have been right after the breach, and there are others like them, right?
So staying on that topic for a minute, Rohit, the topic of compliance, right? Traditionally, the way I've seen compliance is it's policies and procedures. There's somebody who's out there in the legal department who's a bit removed from technology and even the capabilities of technology, right? They don't know. In a way, it's good that they don't know what can be done, so they don't have to relegate the policy to just what can be done, but write policy independently. Are you finding policymakers are kind of ahead of the game, or are they learning and being reactive, like in the case of airline security, with people checking shoes after the first shoe bomb? Is that what's happening, or do you think these are people who are thinking out of the box? And I haven't really come across great examples, and I'm sure there are those examples. But what do you think is, where is compliance? Is it kind of ahead of the game and we just haven't gotten around to implementing what compliance wants? Or is compliance always playing catch up with breaches?
I think, in my experience at least, compliance is a design by committee animal, right? So we all know what those are called. And I think it's always behind the times. By the time it gets legislated and then rolled out, even if it's not legislated, like PCI, for example, it's always the low watermark, in my opinion. So it's just designed to handle the last problem that happened and then maybe one or two previous to that, but it's never forward-looking, unfortunately. The good companies are realizing that and saying, okay, let me at least get to the base level that is compliant so I can check the box and not get sued for it, and then raise the profile beyond that once I get past that particular compliance audit. So they are trying, but I would definitely not agree that compliance is ahead of the game by any means.
So I have a slightly different perspective here. I think the reason why we see that there's a slight challenge in compliance is because the business models are constantly changing, right? 10 years back, the adoption of technology in multiple business models was non-existent. And as companies adopt technologies which are much more conducive to online and quick on the phone, mobile, and so on and so forth, I think there is definitely the awareness that they need to be a little bit ahead of the game. And I think some really top-notch players have made investments in compliance to be ahead of the game. What's happened, though, is I think that has reduced the streamline of the business that typically exists. What I mean by that is, again, I think people are slowing down because of a lot of compliance restrictions, because there's no clear forethought. This is, again, my personal opinion. I think there needs to be a little bit more maturity that needs to be driven in the compliance side, which tends to be more restrictive than helping move the business forward. So that's sort of my perspective.
Yeah, well, I'm actually really glad that Venki brought it up, Rohit, because yeah, compliance is a huge driver for purchasing security products today. I mean, at ArcSight, a little more than half of our revenue by the time HP acquired us was being driven by compliance. That's not to say the security guys didn't want it for other reasons, but compliance was what gets the CFO to sign the check. So if you're trying to sell security products, compliance can be a great thing for selling it. But I think in terms of whether or not it's ahead of the business, to your question, Karthik, it really isn't, because unfortunately, the main reason for compliance is driven by the don't get sued, don't be held liable. And in general, and I'm not a lawyer, so certainly don't take any of this advice, but in general, businesses have a reasonable defense if they can say, we were following generally accepted best business practices. So in other words, if nobody else has a firewall, you don't have to buy one either. That's not to say you shouldn't have a firewall, but you don't have to be better than everyone else. So sort of by its very nature, compliance is generally geared to a lowest common denominator of everyone has to do this. But it's just, I think it's never going to really lead. But it is a great thing to get people to sign purchase orders, because CFOs being held liable for things tends to get their attention.
Yeah, like Sarabin-Oxley. So, on this one, I don't know if there's a good, right viewpoint or not, but one thing I have not seen, and I think legal and compliance should really be different people. And they have to take a chapter out of Silicon Valley or high tech or tech innovation, in that the biggest disruptors have been people who don't necessarily come from the same industry all the time. I mean, there is something to be said for expertise, deep expertise. There's also something to be said for the kind of people who can think out of the box, who are not tied down by knowledge of what can be done. So I really think these should be advanced business leaders who are provided the role to be in compliance and say, here's what an ideal compliance set of regulations should be. I'm not going to enforce this on day one and have people clamoring for products that don't really do it but claim to do it. I really think someone from the outside who's not legal, who's not a technologist, somebody who's really a savvy business guy should come in and play the role of compliance officer and say, this is what really needs to be done in order to improve security in this industry. I don't know if that's the right answer or wrong. I have yet to be, no one's been able to prove that. But that's what I personally think should happen, which is completely out of the spectrum of technology. So let's shift gears a little bit. There is this, everybody's got a mobile device and they're all asked to turn it off before the event. So mobile devices, they brought in a whole new paradigm to security. I mean, to a bunch of different things, to e-commerce and advertising and all kinds of consumerish things, but to security, right? So most companies have a bring your own device policy. There are these MDM players who push stuff out to devices. But there's a whole host of mobile devices, not just your cell phones and iPads, whole set of mobile devices that bring a new dimension of security challenges to the industry. So I want Bob and Venki and Rohit to comment a little bit about what is this mobile angle. Is it going to be driven by regulation, or is it going to be driven by self-policing, or some combination of the two?
So I guess my view is, as we just talked about, I don't see regulation leading. I see regulation following. For right or wrong, compliance and regulation are largely about not getting sued, not about actually solving security problems. So Much as I'd like to think they'll lead, I don't think they will. I think mobile, we're just going to see it go through an evolution, and it's probably going to take not quite as long as it did for desktops, but the same basic evolution over the next 5 to 10 years where, if you think about it, every problem that we spent the last 20 years solving for PCs and for Macs, how do you get software updates to them? How do you make sure they're patched? How do you control them? How do you audit what they're doing? Those are all problems that took a very long time to solve in scalable enterprise ways. Every single one of those problems applies to mobile. A mobile device, aside from the fact that it doesn't have a physical keyboard, has more power than any PC that we would have bought 10 years ago. More storage, more ability to do stuff. There's no reason to think that just because it's labeled as a phone or a tablet instead of a PC, that you won't have to solve all the same problems about patching, about inventory, about desktop AV, about whatever you want to think of. And right now, we're just not there yet. You mentioned mobile device management, and the MDM products are a great start. But so far, all they're doing is really the equivalent of software distribution and configuration management. And if you think about what you use in an enterprise to manage desktop PCs, you have a lot more than just software configuration and desktop management for those. It's a lot more than pushing out patches and updates. And so we're just not there yet on mobile. We'll get there, but I think it'll take years. We'll hopefully leverage the experience in desktop, and it won't take as long, but it's still not going to be overnight. But again, I'm probably the cynic up here to some degree.
Bob, I completely agree with what you just said. And Karthik, to answer your question as well, I do think it's a mix. It's going to be a mix of both. So I think there's a bunch of self-policing that'll happen in the next few years, which is enterprises driving their employees to conform to certain standards, and much more than what they had done in the past. And also because, frankly, as I've had this conversation before as well, there's no clear understanding or knowledge of what are these devices that are connecting to the network. I mean, the biggest challenge, if you ask a CIO and what challenge do they have with the BYOD, is they have no understanding of where the perimeter actually stops, right? And I think that's where I strongly believe that it's sort of a mixed model where you will have to rely on some of these, the owners of the mobile devices to ensure that there's some amount of compliance on the periphery. And then obviously there's going to be some sort of restrictive guidance from the enterprises as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, for one of the things we've done, for example, at our company, which is obviously quite small still, but all mobile devices are on the guest network and they're not connected to the corporate network. So yes, you can bring them to work. Yes, you can use them for email, but it doesn't have access to the full corporate network. It's a simple thing. People are doing that already. Just like that, you'll see separation on the mobile device where certain applications can access but others cannot. So all of those policies will come into play. They're not there today. And I agree, as Karthik said, the fact is that this is an evolving problem. As Bob pointed out, same problems that happen with PCs are going to happen with mobile devices as well. There's a word of advice for you. I actually think that your 3G network is probably more secure than anything you can put a PC on today in your office or home. So you may be better off doing your e-commerce on that, actually.
Does anybody suggest we should all go back to the BlackBerry as the one standard device? Get done? No? Okay. I thought I'll ask. So keep on that, the mobile device kind of a dimension. The cloud is an important dimension too. And so there's more and more relevance of cloud in the enterprise. CIOs are not pushing back on cloud applications. They're in fact embracing cloud applications. So what's happening is there's a lot of dependence on ERP on the cloud, or PeopleSoft, or HR on the cloud, and productivity apps on the cloud, and file sharing on the cloud. And clearly that adds a whole new dimension of security challenges to the enterprise. So talk a bit about how that is affecting the enterprise.
Yeah, I think when you look at applications being used in the enterprise, and especially cloud or SaaS applications, then clearly insider threats, data leakage, inadvertent or malicious, it becomes a really big issue. And it's a problem that is still in the early stages because there's so many different applications that are being used, and some of them are encrypted, so it's really hard to even look at the data that's going back and forth. So that problem is definitely a very much insider-focused problem. The other side of that is, I move my application to the cloud, how do I protect it? And that is a completely different issue because you don't have control over that application as much as you did earlier. You don't have the same technologies available in actually protecting that application. And it's now open to the outside world. when you had your application running in-house, you could set up rules that only certain IP addresses could connect. You could set up ACLs. Can't do all those things in the cloud. So I think that there's a whole dimension of on SaaS applications that the enterprises are using, where there's a bigger issue, I think, around leakage, and then B, cloud applications where there's a totally different threat vector that didn't exist in the enterprise.
So I think, my opinion, very much consistent with what you have. I think as enterprises start adopting some of the SaaS and the cloud technologies, I think the bigger concern that they have is how are they working with the data that's actually being transmitted outside of their current network. And I think the bigger challenge that most CIOs today face is just even knowing what kind of applications are people accessing. The more conversations that I've had with CIOs, the biggest question they have is, do I really know who is transmitting data or who's even using a SaaS application that I'm unaware of? Your most SaaS subscriptions are under $100 mark, maybe a few $1,000s mark per month. And I was just having this conversation with Rohit. Most of those purchasing decisions get made at multiple different levels. By the time that percolates up to the CIO, I think it's pretty late. So just even understanding what that perimeter actually is, or where is all the data that's moving in and out, is actually one of the biggest challenges that, and I've heard of a few companies that are actually trying to sort of solve that problem, but again, it's very early stage.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add is I actually worry sometimes that companies are being too trusting with SaaS services. I mean, they're basically just sort of, oh, we're putting the data up there and then we don't really worry about it. I mean, okay, you're trusting Salesforce because they're a big company. They have all your CRM data, but do you really know? I mean, that's a bad example. Salesforce probably does have fairly good internal practices to make sure your data is secure. But if you look at all the different SaaS companies out there that enterprises are trusting to put all kinds of confidential data in, it's highly unlikely that all of them are actually using good data security practices, segregating data on the back end, and actually running things operationally in a good way. Because once you put data up on Amazon, for example, if you put some confidential data up on EC2, you're basically trusting every single person at Amazon who has admin access to that data to not do something to it. And that could be thousands of people, and you don't know anything about any of them. And that actually worries me some that, 15, 20 years ago, when you started doing outsourced services over the internet, I did that at VeriSign back in the mid-90s. Our big problem was persuading people that it was okay to send something up over the internet at all. That was back when people wouldn't put a credit card on the internet, and we had to convince them SSL made credit cards okay. And there's an old Dilbert from years ago where it shows Dilbert saying, oh, I'd never put a credit card on the internet, as he hands his credit card to a stranger who walks away, comes back 10 minutes later with his check at the restaurant, wearing a mink coat and a tiara. So, we had to solve that problem. Now, I think the pendulum has swung too far the other way, and people are perfectly willing to trust cloud service providers, even when they probably shouldn't every single time, or at least do a little more diligence first before you hand over lots of very confidential data. So even if you know who your people are who are accessing it, which I agree is a big issue, you also need to make sure that whoever you're using to provide the cloud service really is as trustworthy as you hope they are.
So a couple of important things that came up here. One is AWS. I mean, that's just an example of a very important cloud service, all prevalent. Every one of us in some shape or form use some sort of an Amazon service. It's a largely untapped market for new entrepreneurs out there who are thinking in a different dimension. There is a lot of scope for advancing security in AWS environments in different applications. The second thing that came up in this discussion is the trust and the advancement of technology go hand in hand. So the fact that I put a credit card on the internet today is because credit card companies have become more advanced in detecting fraud. So that actually helps my trust. So you have to have visible improvements in technology and the ability to do things on the security front that then lets you do more things. Now I have a credit card, I use it all the time, it's never gotten breached, and shouldn't say that, but I did. And
that you know of.
Yeah, that I know of. 243 days later, I'll tell you differently. So that's important. So you have to have the level of trust that goes along with advancement of technology. Today I know when I travel, some little credit card fraud algorithm is going to point to the fact that I'm now charging a card in Singapore and I live here in the Bay Area. So I know these things are happening, so I use it more freely. I think in various other aspects of security, we've got to provide the level of security and confidence so people can do more things. Technology should always be the enabler. So I think that's an important thing that's come up in the last several years is we all feel more confident about doing business on the internet than we did 5 years ago. So that's an important thing. A third dimension, we talk about mobile, we talk about the cloud. Another important dimension is the Internet of Things, which is a combination of these, IoT. Every device here, and if there's Wi-Fi here, there's 100 people in the room, there's probably 300 devices that are connected to the Wi-Fi. Right? You've got watches, you've got cell phones, you've got all kinds of things speaking to each other too. So this is machine to machine, this is the Internet of Things. So let's talk a bit about that dimension. What does that add to security? Should we even worry about it? Are we just unnecessarily worrying about these things adding complexity? Or is it a real problem that we just don't like to think about?
I think it's part of both. I think there are going to be real security problems as you start putting more things on the net. Like one of my neighbors has a Bluetooth-enabled, internet-connected locks on his house. So he can unlock it remotely from an iPhone app to let someone in, which I have to admit is kind of cool. But that's a security problem I'd actually worry about. On the other hand, you read stories about like Nest thermostats, and if somebody breaks into your house, they can hack into the Nest. They physically take it off the wall. They can plug into a USB port and hack it. If somebody's broken into my house, them hacking the thermostat is really not high on my list of worries. Or similarly, using Nest to monitor when I'm away, because if they breach the Nest security on the back end, they can see when it's away sensor says I'm not at home. Again, yes, they could do that, but there's plenty of other ways that are much simpler, frankly, and require less skill to tell when nobody's at home. So I'm not worried about that. So I think it's a combination of there are things that we should worry about, but there's a lot of things where, yes, there's a theoretical risk to security or privacy there, but you need to think about, is this really, if somebody does breach it in that way, is that really changing anything about my life? Or is it just one more way they could get at this data that was already pretty widely available? In other words, don't freak out about stuff like somebody will know when you're not home. They'll see all the lights are turned off. They'll know no one's at home. They don't need to look at your Nest thermometer through the internet to figure that out. I love my Nest, by the way.
Great point, Bob. Let me actually take the other side of the spectrum. I was having a conversation with a device manufacturer, a healthcare device manufacturer, and one of their key concerns was they were making pacemakers, and the pacemaker actually connected to a central nervous system, which had the potential to get breached, which basically meant you could ruin the life of anyone who was connected on that network, right? And this was the conversation we were having on, like, how do you think about that when you're spending money on sort of software development? How do you embed that kind of security into your software development life cycle? And sort of that's the other end of the spectrum. And Karthik, as I was mentioning earlier, like I see there are like multiple segments in the market. Obviously the first is all the financial institutions and the healthcare guys who already spent a bunch of money. But then there's also the other end of the spectrum, which is more on manufacturing. People who've not really thought about security, but again, a lot of them are adopting sensors and everything that's on the trying to get connected. Even all your car manufacturers today have some sort of chip. And imagine someone else taking control of your car. I mean, we're always amazed at the Google car running in Mountain View, but then that obviously opens a new can of worms. And so that sort of is the other end of the spectrum. Just keeping a balance of where we want to focus on is, I think, extremely important in the next 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, I think that this whole Internet of Things is in such an early stage right now that nobody really knows. There are examples that you pointed out that are obvious, but it's just too early to tell where it's going to be. And the way I think about this is, I'm sure how many of you had computer science in college? I'm sure there's a good chunk of you. And how many took courses in security as a part of that curriculum? I would bet there'd be a handful of that, right? I mean, I did the same thing. It just isn't part of our curriculum yet. It's not something that when software is designed that people even think about. They're starting to think about it. There are now constructs you can use that protect you. But by and large, most of the software that was developed in the last 15, 20 years did not have security in mind. It's always an afterthought. And so you don't know when these systems get connected to the internet, what the interplay is going to be, what's going to get hacked. So yes, I mean, I don't worry about it. I have a Nest as well, and I probably have 25, 30 devices connected at home too. I don't worry about it today, but I'm sure in 5 years, it's going to be a hot topic and people will worry about it, and that's the opportunity.
I don't have any other dimensions of security to add, but I'll tell you I got an idea for the next panel discussion from Venki. The Google car, the driverless car and its implications to society. I think it'll be a really cool topic for the next discussion we have. It's got security implications, it's got are all the chauffeurs and taxi cabs going to go out of business? I'm really going to think about this one. And then we'll invite you back to that. So, let's talk about a little. So, I just want to finish off that previous topic. I think it is, as everybody said, a good combination of being aware. I think the right answer in my mind, at least as this is how I like to think about it. And lately I've been thinking a lot about security. And as the saying goes, the more you know about something, the more worried you get about things. And I think that's important, not to get worried per se, but to be aware of the possibilities. For example, a very simple thing that most people normally do, and I didn't, is hide the Wi-Fi network at home. It's password protected, why would I hide it? But then, when I saw a number of parked cars, at various points of the day, around the corner, and I live in a corner lot, around the corner, and one day I parked myself there, and I said, what can I see of my house? The first thing I saw was the Wi-Fi network. And it's a pretty strong network. 100 feet from the house, you get it. So the best thing is to hide the network, right? I mean, that's the first thing you want to do is to hide the network. So you don't worry about it. But all I'm saying is being aware of what connects where and being aware of the various dimensions is a good thing. It's a good first step. You don't have to solve all this. You don't have to get worried about all of this. I see Bob shaking his head. I don't know what he thinks about closed Wi-Fi networks.
Hiding it won't help.
Yeah, if you're a good hacker.
My solution is you can't see my network until you're in the house.
You have a big house, I have a small house.
No, I have a lot of
So he's created a bunker, right? So that's one form of security, and getting a dog too. So let's talk a bit about technology, the implications of technology. So there's Hadoop, this is a big data and security topic, and Hadoop gets thrown about in all contexts. And I personally think it's not just that. Obviously, there is a huge implication of how Hadoop can apply to this problem, right, and solve it too. Like it did for example, machine learning techniques have gotten huge advancements in advertising and e-commerce, where they really know who the person is who's visiting a site or shopping on a site, or right? I mean, you get very custom, tailored things. The same thing absolutely can be applied in the enterprise to know who is who, and therefore create a security profile about them, etc. So clearly there is the applicability of Hadoop and related technologies to security. I just want to get a few thoughts, and acknowledging that none of us here are deep technologists, but can you guys talk a little bit about the applications of Hadoop? Have you seen any real world, I've solved this problem using this Hadoop technology or machine learning algorithm? I mean, it's all emerging. There's a lot of talk about it. What's your take on big data technologies being applied to security?
Yeah, so I will speak to sort of the latter, which is big data techniques applied to security. That's germane to our business. We have about 2,700 customers that we process data for. The company was started about 10 years ago, before Hadoop really sort of took off. So we don't use Hadoop for our own system. There are reasons for it. It's not a transactionally oriented system, and we provide real-time data to our customers, and they can do real-time reporting and things that Hadoop really isn't the best for. So from a big data perspective, security is a fantastic use case for it. And the fact that we are processing something like 4 petabytes of data, that's what we have under management today. And it's real time, it's instant, it's all on spinning disk. That's because we have a big data engine that can process that data, give you exactly the source of an attack. We can tell you what happened. You can go back in time and look a year, 2 years, 5 years ago and find that data. That's all the application of big data techniques. You have a massive grid engine that processes this data to collect that information. But ultimately, all of that is about, okay, can I find the problem, but then I still have to triage it. Is it really a problem? Who's going to decide if it is a problem based on patterns that I'm seeing? So big data can solve a lot of these problems, but today the state of the art that I see is that it's not enough to make a definitive answer yet. and that's where people are still required. Over time, I think with more data and more processing and faster processing, we'll get there. But today, it's a great start, but it's an unsolved problem, at least not completely solved.
The way I look at it, I think I had a conversation a few months back with a CTO, and I was just asking, where do you see Hadoop really help versus the analytics that you guys typically do in the Security Operations Center? And the answer was really pretty intriguing. He said, analytics can answer the questions that you're asking, but if you really use Hadoop, it will help you ask the right questions, which is, if you have someone accessing some patient records who are not supposed to, why are they doing that? If there is a specific pattern that some people are following, which seems to be somewhere out there, why is that happening? So asking the right questions is probably where Hadoop takes you, and I think that's the marked difference between what we see in analytics and sort of Hadoop. And I always compare Hadoop to, and I completely agree with your point that we're sort of very early on, there's a lot to be done, but I sort of compare Hadoop to sort of photography. Back in the days before digital photography, you would wait for the perfect shot and take like one shot because you knew you had like 32 in there or 24, whatever the size was. But then today you take like 10 different shots and just wait for the one perfect shot, right? Just pick the one that's perfect and delete the rest. And I think that's what Hadoop can help you is crunch a number of things and then potentially come up with 5, 6, 7 different options for which you can pursue the next level in like 1 or 2 of them. So I think that's where I'm seeing Hadoop being implemented more or less.
Yeah, I mean, I think Hadoop is great because it's providing a necessary piece of plumbing as security and the amount of data you're dealing with continues to grow. To put it in perspective, when ArcSight was started in 2000, we chose to use Oracle Enterprise as the underlying database. That was fine. It worked. It scaled decently for the time. By 2007, our biggest customers were running databases of 50 to 100 gigabytes. And a 100 gigabyte Oracle Enterprise database is a very expensive proposition, or at least it was in 2007. Today, or as of 2 years ago when I left ArcSight, the biggest ArcSight customers were running data stores on the order of 5 to 15 petabytes for single customers. There is no way you would ever in a million years build an Oracle Enterprise system of 10 petabytes. I'm pretty sure it's theoretically impossible, and even if it were theoretically possible, you would spend a significant portion of the government's budget to do that. It's not, Larry would be very happy. The rest of us would all be paying higher taxes. So Hadoop, and unfortunately ArcSight made that decision in 2007 when Hadoop hadn't really come into being yet. So we basically built our own Hadoop-like data store. That's what ArcSight is based on now. If we were doing it today, we would just use Hadoop off the shelf and it would be great. So for the new generation of security companies, Hadoop is a wonderful building block that lets you build a solution that's orders of magnitude more scalable than you would have been able to build 10 years ago with SQL and SQL-like databases. But the nice thing is now you can just pull Hadoop and all the Hadoop infrastructure and associated products off the shelf, and you can build something with a very small technology investment that can scale to tens of petabytes and beyond with the existing software. So it's a huge win from that point of view. I won't tell you how much ArcSight spent building their own Hadoop equivalent, but unfortunately, we shipped it right as Hadoop was starting to take off. That have spent the last few years. I think my team still answers questions about, why didn't you use Hadoop? Because now it looks stupid to have built a Hadoop equivalent, but when we made the decision 6 years ago, it was a different story.
So on that note of timing, right, why is security all of a sudden a hot topic? I mean, it's been an important topic for a very long time. As long as data has existed, or physical or electronic, there's always been a concern about security, but of late it seems like it's taken an unusually high priority on everybody's list. What is it? Is it the technology coming together that is able to solve problems that were not able to be solved before? Or is it that the attackers have somehow gotten significantly more sophisticated and are doing damage in areas where we never imagined damage to happen? What's the cause of security being at the forefront now, unusually?
I actually don't think it's anything different. I think it's a matter of perception. If you look back, Splunk went public a couple of years ago and was one of the biggest IPOs of their time. In 2008, ArcSight was the only Silicon Valley company to go public in an 18-month period as the market crashed. We were a security company. VeriSign was a huge IPO in the late 90s as a security company. I think the only difference now is there's a lot more press around security, because now a security breach doesn't just affect the geeks or the internal people. Now it's 150 million credit card records being stolen from Target. I saw a statistic yesterday that was saying half of the people in the U.S. have been the victims of identity theft, or at least their identities have been stolen. They could be like me. I got an email yesterday. I can show it to you if you want on my phone, from the Department of Justice telling me that there's some case being prosecuted in San Francisco in federal court by someone who's an identity theft criminal, and my identity was one of those that was stolen. I haven't seen any effect of that. My credit report's still fine. Nobody's taking any money, but my name, social security number, and everything else was on a list found in this guy's possession on his computer. And so I think that's the difference. Is it's not that it's security has really changed. It's that now the breaches are affecting everybody, and so they're getting, they're making headlines in USA Today and on CNN, whereas 10 years ago they made headlines in InfoWorld and PC Week, so we all saw them. But your grandparents didn't call you up worried about the latest security problem. Now, my parents do call me up worried about the latest security problem.
So, Karthik, I think to your point, I do think there have been some elevated understanding of what security actually means, and we're seeing more and more board conversations and impact at the really high level of the business. I think a few years back, much of it was probably in the technology side of the business. Technology wasn't as intertwined with business, but today technology is running business. Almost every industry that you look at, technology is at the heart and soul of it. And when there is a security impact or anything that even remotely causes a concern on the security side of things, I think there's red flags going all the way through, right from the CIO all the way up to the chairman of the board, right? And I think that profile has obviously gone up. And to Bob's point, I think there's obviously a lot more press around it today than we had 5 years back, because most people did not, I think, weren't aware of the impact of security. And I think now that given there's a lot more press, and obviously the profile going up, I think that's one of the reasons why we're hearing more and more of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think the media is definitely a key part of this. If you look back, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie War Games. It's an old movie in the 80s, right? What was that about? It was about this kid hacking into the Department of Defense systems and setting off what he thought was a nuclear war, right? And that's what people did. It was about hacking and making cool things happen. It was about almost being found out for it, because that's what was he became famous. Now it's the exact opposite. Now it's about hacking in and not being found. It's lying low and sitting on it and pulling down so much data. And so because the stakes are so much higher, you don't want to be found. There are sort of nation states that are attacking. There are large groups in Russia, for example, whose job it is to really go hack systems for profit. And so now when a problem gets found out, there's a lot of people affected by it. So that's what really causes more attention to it. And media is definitely a key problem part of it. But also the stakes are a lot higher. You've got now so much more data being transacted, so much more information that's valuable. Think about any contract that's being run for a global level. Somebody finds out what Exxon's going to bid for it. Their competitor is going to go bid a little bit lower and win it. That's the kind of stuff that's happening now. It's not just about credit card data that's being stolen.
So Rohit, would you say that it's largely because of the financial impact of some of this that you see?
Yeah, definitely. I think financial, directly or indirectly, and there are security impacts as well, right? There's a whole study around how vulnerable transportation systems and nuclear power plants and power grids are. And that's not about financial impact. It's really about just, security that's an issue for the country. So financial is definitely probably the biggest one, but it's, closely following that is just general security.
Mm-hmm. So before we get into the closing statements, we are at about 8:15 right now. I wanted to see what the audience had in terms of questions. I promised the panel this is always a talkative, interactive audience. So we need questions from the audience. So there are mics. If you raise your hand, we'll pick one of you. Yes. Question.
Is there a mic?
There is a mic coming here. And on this side, there's a mic as well.
Yeah, my name is Errol. I'm not a techie either. So I have a question totally outside, which is basically you guys talk about the incredible amount of security that you're going to put in within the enterprises. But there's also the other side. Let's say, for example, a bank account. Grandma doesn't worry too much about her computer and her password that she keeps. Are there attackers who are coming through the back door, if you like, without having to hack? The big enterprises would hack the small computers, literally, with such ease, because they're not protected like you are, and then get in with great ease. With what's the use of all your phenomenal security if grandma's little computer is taken up?
I'll give you my little perspective on that, but you guys should. So what is also happening, and we are actively involved in some of these opportunities, the banks, the retail sites of these banks, for instance, and next week I'm actually at a bank on the East Coast who's worried about this exact same problem. So it's a valid problem, first of all. And the solution to that is not the endpoints, right? The endpoints are going to be as insecure, unsecured as they are right now. The solution to this is to catch it at the point of entry, not necessarily the perimeter. What I mean is, on the retail banking side, catch a behavioral change, right? I mean, grandma doesn't do large wire transfers out to Bob's account. Why is she doing that today? Your grandma did, not mine. So that's the sort of thing we need to be able to catch is you're never going to be able to secure every single device out there. I mean, yes, when it ships out, perhaps there are some things inherently in here, but there are some things that have got to be built on the actual transaction system, as well as when you log into something, there are these multi-factor authentication capabilities too, which I've done to a lot of my accounts, including Gmail and other accounts. So these are all things that are happening that don't necessarily rely on the user, but more kind of navigate towards a more secure scenario. Having said that, you guys may have other thoughts too to add if you do.
Let me add to that. I completely agree with your assessment, but I also think the profile of that endpoint, the security profile of that endpoint has constantly changed over the years, right? The endpoint as it was in 2002 versus, or whatever, 2004 versus today is completely different. And I think there obviously needs to be done, there's a lot more that needs to be done there. And to Karthik's point, you can never fully protect what is out of your control. And yet restricting that would be sort of significant loss to business. Yes. So obviously there has to be some amount of security at the endpoint. And I think that continues to go up. But at the same time, as Karthik mentioned, there has to be a lot on the back end to ensure that once there is any threat that's actually coming your way, you're able to quickly react to it before it actually penetrates in and just stop it at the perimeter or at some point where it doesn't impact any internal organs.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you another example. So if you travel to Europe, you'll find almost everybody's credit card has a chip on it. Right? That because they really take that seriously, it's part of the system. And it was really designed because the systems there were not connected to the internet. There was no phone line or internet connectivity. That's why they put the chip on it. Now, even today, despite all the credit card theft here, chip and PIN is still not a standard in the US. It's because we think it hurts the transaction. The consumer has to do these things and fill out and put this PIN in, and they don't remember, and the transaction won't happen. So banks are willing to take on that liability of saying, yeah, there's a certain percentage of transactions that will be fraudulent. Banks have the same problem for your bank account, for your grandma as well. They just take certain losses every year because they don't want to make it hard on you. And eventually, that value will become big enough that they will say, okay, enough is enough. We're not going to let this happen anymore. Two-factor is a good example of that. Now a lot of people are saying you have to have two factors.
May I ask a second question also?
Yes, please. Anyone else?
Yeah. If you have now that you people are looking at the attacker coming to you, are the security people looking at studying the behavior pattern of potential attackers like the CIAs do and seeing what activities are going on in points X, maybe 5,000 behavior people, whose behavior is predictable and they are up to some mischief. Is there any technology that allows that behavior pattern?
Yes, that's what we do. There's not a company pitch, but yes, there are. Yes, I mean, it's kind of newer. People traditionally look for signs, patterns that are visible, known attacks, and things like that. But I think this is the time where we have to transcend from being reactive to more predictive, because technologies exist today. We just have to leverage it for security. So yes, I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, my name is Larry, and I studied networking years ago in college, and my knowledge is quite old, so pardon me for my nomenclature errors here, but has the security community kind of done a Pareto chart of what and where the failure modes are? I mean, are the hackers, are they breaching into the firewall and actually stealing packets from inside the firewall, or are they tapping in to the network somewhere outside and making unauthorized, like, and is it packets they're stealing, or is it at a lower level or a higher level? I'm just curious that's kind of a technical question, but what are the failure modes and where do they happen?
Well, I think it's all of the above, unfortunately, right? But the simplest things like the JPMC one, it's a phishing attack. It doesn't need to be anything very complicated. It's an email that gets sent to somebody, they open up the email and it carries a payload. That's probably the single biggest attack vector that we see these days. You can do much more complex things like SQL injection and other things that will like compromise actual web applications. But the easiest way to do that today is to send an email to somebody, they click on a link, and at that point, the attacker's in the network. You don't have to do anything very fancy like compromising firewalls. People do that too. And so there are industries around protecting that. But just very, very simple things are good enough these days to attack.
Once you open it, it just launches a subroutine, puts it on the network, and then maybe lays dormant like you guys were talking about.
Basically, you click on something and it says it's going to be pictures of Angelina Jolie's wedding from this weekend, and now they've got a keyboard monitor installed on your operating system that just sends every keystroke you type up to somebody. So when they see you type, there's a prompt password : and then here's what he typed. They now have your password. Anybody who can actually look at packet decodes with a protocol analyzer and get information that way probably has a legitimate job making good money already, and isn't, yes, you could steal stuff that way, but it's much more common that it's easier to just buy, and there are marketplaces for this. You can buy malware, package it up and email it to your victims. Some percentage of them will open and install the malware, and you're done. And these things are commercial products. You can even go and file trouble tickets and feature enhancement requests. I'm not kidding about any of this. It's actually pretty scary. So you really don't need to be a technologist who can look at firewalls and stuff.
So they're basically just clever Trojan horses that are...
Yep.
Pretty much, yeah.
So that email with funds being transferred to you from Nigeria, I would not open that. Question.
Yeah, so I have some questions, I guess, for Bob and anybody else, since you talked about CISOs and CIOs. So just to provide context, just to provide context for my question, I go to a lot of meetings where I routinely meet CIOs and CISOs, but normally these tend to be from large regulated institutions, namely financial and medical or compliance kind of people. And I sort of sporadically meet people, even from large corporations, who have their token security customers. So I guess what I've seen is there's very little sort of budget or interest in security in non-regulated. Is that sort of, are you seeing a little bit broader interest in security beyond that, or what is it?
Yeah, I'll keep my answer brief, but we'll love to hear from the others. Yes, absolutely. So I see it in social media. I see it in companies like, File, Sync and Share type of companies. They have different titles: Chief Risk Officer, Chief Trust Officer, Chief Information Security Officer. And I absolutely think that role is going to become more and more important. And as Bob or someone else said earlier, the role itself is not new. I mean, we may have different titles now, catchier titles and maybe more relevant titles to that industry. But the importance of that role in that it's become a line management role, in that there are people reporting to this person and there is an actual budget for this person. I think that's key. So I absolutely think that role has become more important and is more relevant to decision making. Love to hear opinions.
Yeah, so I mean, you will see security guys, I think, now at every company above a certain size. I mean, if we're talking about a 30-person construction firm in the Valley, probably not. But when you're talking about companies with hundreds, thousands, and more employees, but there is a huge variance. If you look at how much, say, Goldman Sachs spends on network security, or Citibank spends on network security, and how many people they have, versus the size of the team at Target or Walmart, which are both also very large companies, the financial institutions spend an order of magnitude more money than somebody like a Walmart or a Target. And then if you compare Walmart to somebody like, I don't know, a big furniture manufacturer, they'll be, yet another level down from there. So there's definitely a huge range in terms of how much value they put on security. Part of it's also their risk profile. Do they have intangible assets that are likely to be stolen, or is the worst that's going to happen somebody steals their customer list? So there's differences, but yeah, you're absolutely right that a lot of companies that are outside of kind of regulated or financial services, healthcare type industries, security is much more of an afterthought still. It's changing, Karthik's right, but there's a long way to go before everybody is at the same level as the big banks, for example.
Are you suggesting that as an industry, retail, despite the fact that Walmart is $400 million in revenue, not spending enough relative to?
Well, as a vendor of security products, nobody spends enough. But certainly, I'm saying if you compare, but seriously, if you compare how many employees Walmart has, how big their network is, how many devices, and compare that to, say, Citibank, in terms of size of network, number of employees or something, they're very comparable. Citibank spends a lot more money on network security than Walmart. I'm not saying Walmart should be spending more, but I'm saying his perception is absolutely correct that there's a big difference as you cross industries and as you cross roles. It's not just every $100 billion revenue company spends the same amount. There are big differences based on the types of companies as well.
Walmart is 400.
Well, okay, but I don't know how big Citibank is, but I'm just saying somewhere up there. But yeah, but despite that, so that's actually a good example. So Citi is, what, a seventh the revenue. And I know for a fact they spend a lot more on network security. And that's, different industries, different needs, different risks. It's not necessarily wrong, but it is reality. Yeah, part of it is how regulated are you? Do you have to comply with, and how many regulations? There's a lot of perfectly good reasons. It's not to say that Walmart's not spending enough, but it's a very valid point that there are differences.
We'll have time for one question more. We want to wrap it up.
Since I have the mic,
you have the mic, so you have the question.
Hi, my name is Nagesh. Thank you for the panel. I have a comment and a question. The comment is historically, security has been such a technology-oriented domain where people have celebrated complexity. We have reached a state where the complexity needs to be so hidden that it's profoundly simple for anything in the future to succeed. That's my comment. My question is, what do you think of creating hacking courses in universities or creating hacking teams in every major organization? There was a big debate. The professor in, I think, Ohio State tried to create. It's like you're now creating quote unquote unethical things in the minds of the student. I want to hear your take on it.
So I guess we all have probably a thought on that. I think it's an incredibly good idea for students to learn about how to hack. I mean, one of the things, I graduated with a CS degree in 1988, which there weren't a lot of us doing it back then. And one of the useful things we did was learn how you crack passwords and various flaws in the OSs that we had at the time that let you break into systems. And you have to understand that, I think, to be able to secure it. At ArcSight, we sent about a quarter of our engineers every year to DEF CON, just to absorb the environment and learn how the bad guys thought. And I think that's not a bad thing. You don't want people doing it every day, but knowing how the bad guys think is important if you're going to try and stop them.
Any comments?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I think it's much more prevalent now for large enterprises to actually invest in a team that thinks like hackers do. And it's extremely logical as well, is you can never be on the other side and really interpret what the other side is talking about, right? This is exactly like how the QA mindset is. You will always try to sort of find a bug rather than looking as someone who's developed the code and try to be a little bit more compassionate to it. And it's pretty prevalent. We've had multiple conversations. Almost everyone who's actually matured and made significant investments in security is actually now having a team, or at least thinking of having a team in the short term to sort of have these, not essentially hacks or have a bad mindset, but really think as hackers do and sort of fortify the perimeter as such.
Mm-hmm. Completely agree. I mean, we have a practice in our company to have an offense and a defense team. And the goal of that is to see how good our own product is and how we can improve it even further. There is this whole set of people who do penetration testing, pen testing, and that's part of it. So I think it's an important element to improve security. And the goal, hopefully, is not to teach people necessarily to make a living out of hacking, but to be aware of these are the possibilities if you're a smart guy. And therefore, hopefully, you build software that prevents those from happening. That should be the goal. Maybe one last question. All right.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Ashutosh Sharma. I have a question about the whole breaching part. In the past, when there were viruses, the legislation got into action, and they systematically took punitive measures to, vanquish those people who created viruses. So, is there anything going to be in the case of these data breaches and these kind of security breaches as well, or are we going to continue to play defense and allocate big budgets for this cause in every corporation?
Becky, maybe you're in a good position to.
So I think the answer to that question would be largely sort of it depends. Because I don't think it's very clear on what's the source of some of these attacks, right? If you knew, you can probably have a legislation within the US and like restricted at source here. But considering the global nature of the business that we're going through, and we were just having this conversation, the source of the attack might be just that someone actually installed an APT somewhere, and it's actually being sourced from a country that you probably thought was, pretty conducive, or maybe just a business in a country that is, pretty sort of friendly with you, and you wouldn't expect an attack from there, right? So legislation probably only works in the United States or the continental US. But I think that the nature of the problem is more global now than.
Yeah, the same was with viruses, and at least could we curtail this problem in the domestic fashion? And whatever outsiders are doing to this country, we are also, dressing up our Cisco systems and shipping them overseas. So,
dressing up.
It's a reactive approach there.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope to be on.
Yeah, it's a topic for another panel too. So with that, we really want to thank the audience for being here. It's 8:30. We'd like to wrap it up. You can stay for a few minutes if you're interested in talking to any of the panelists. But thank you all for coming. Would really appreciate your time, and we look forward to the next one.